And the people of God said, amen. Amen. Lord, we know whenever you call men and women to declare your holy word, you take the risk of putting treasure in trash, treasure in earthen, weak, flawed, failing, sometimes tired vessels. But you do it so that when your word works, the excellency of the power might be of thee and not of us. So hide us this day behind your cross, cover us in your blood, and fill us with your Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, come. We're preaching, teaching, and hearing power. Amen. It is such an humbling experience to once again be able to share with the Riverside community here in the sanctuary and across the nation and the world, to be here with your pastor who is so gracious. Let's give her a hand and thank God, Pastor Butler. To all of the people here that do so much to make things run well here at Riverside, to all of you who have come this morning, to my church family back home, Greenleaf Christian Church, who Pastor Butler, we're at Riverside this morning. We're live streaming in Goldsboro. And to all of our thousands and thousands of people through Repairers of the Breach and the Moral Revival that are joining by live stream. It is good to be here on this day. Certainly, Lord. He said to me, prophesy over these bones. I told the bones to listen to the word of the Lord. And as I was speaking, some movement started, and the bones came together. He said to me, prophesy to the breath. So I did, and they came alive, and they stood upon their feet as a huge army. Ezekiel 37, John 11, they removed the stone. Jesus looked to heaven and prayed, Father, I'm so thankful that you have listened to me. I know you always do listen, but because of the crowd, because of what they need to hear, so that they might know that you and believe that you have sent me, I'm going to speak. Then he shouted, Lazarus, come out. And he came out, wrapped from head to toe. And Jesus said, unwrap him and let him loose. This morning, I want to try with your prayers to preach when silence is no longer an option. Two texts today are found in our lectionary. We thought it fortuitous, Pastor Butler and I, that these two texts would be the lectionary reading for this day. One is the 37th chapter of Ezekiel, when the prophet finds himself and his people exiled, captured in the grip of political oppression. And the imagery is that of a valley of dry bones, a valley of despair, destitution, depression, and determined oppression. And it's been caused, according to Ezekiel 22, by greedy, lying political figures whose political economy is so hurtful towards women and children and the poor and the sick that the only description sufficient for their political oppression is to call those politicians of that day ravenous, rabies-infested wolves who are devouring the children, the women, and the unfortunate. And included in that group was also the priest, who were taking bribes from the politician, and the priests who were providing unholy cover and quietness in the face of this political oppression. It is in this existential situation that the prophet is given one command, begins in the first chapter, continues throughout Ezekiel. Speak. Speak the truth. Speak the truth. Speak hope. Speak love. Speak justice. But speak. The second text is from the Gospel of John. Jesus finds that his friend Lazarus has died. Death is in the air. There's no telling why Lazarus died, but he died. Could he have died because in the political economy of that day, the 1% had the best health care, and the 99% didn't? Jesus is headed to his own death because he dares to take on what Walter Rauschenbusch once called the constitutional foundations of the kingdom of evil. Jesus is on his way to be killed because he's taking on this tower-building Herod who loves to oppress people, and this Caesar who goes around saying, "I and I alone can save you." And Jesus is about to be crucified because he dared to care for the least of these and to take on greed and political destruction. Before that, Jesus goes to the place of death, and he's bothered by the death of Lazarus. He sees people who are content to accept Lazarus' death. And Lazarus being dead, Jesus said something's not right about this death. And Jesus does one thing: he speaks. He actually says, "Lord, bless what I'm getting ready to say so that the people will know." He knows that raising Lazarus is going to create all kinds of problems for him and Lazarus, because the next text said that they decide they're going to kill Jesus and Lazarus because they represent a power that's greater than Herod, a power that's greater than Caesar, a power that's greater than corrupt religion. But he does not remain silent. Both of these texts have a common narrative. Where there is death, where there is depression, where there is destitution, where there is determined oppression, there must be prophetic speech. In other words, there are times when silence is not an option. Dr. King knew this. Mark, how well did he know it? Now, Dr. King sometimes was a reluctant preacher. Be careful of folk who claim to speak for the Lord that are too eager. Dr. King didn't even want to do what he ended up doing. He wanted to eventually be at Morehouse. Some history say he wanted to pastor this church. But he said the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the time, got upon him, and he knew the burden of truth-telling. But he also knew that there comes a time when silence is not an option, and you must engage in the dangerous ministry of truth-telling. So I thought this morning we would begin by talking some or listening some to the words of Dr. King, the prophetic fire, not the corporatized cute words that they like us to listen to. But I thought for a moment, if I might channel his words. One has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. He wrote that in jail from Birmingham. In 1965, at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, King dared to say, when the leaders of the post-Civil War populist movement began awakening poor white masses and the former Negro slaves to the fact that they were being fleeced by the emerging Bourbon interests, through their control of mass media, they revised the doctrine of white supremacy. During the Reconstruction era, the Southern aristocracy took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. He gave him Jim Crow, and when his wrinkled stomach cried out for the food that his empty pockets could not provide, he ate Jim Crow, a psychological bird that told him that no matter how bad off he was, at least he was white. That's the King. 1967, we've come a long way in our understanding of human motivation and of the blind operation of our economic system. Now we realize that dislocations in the market operation of our economy and the prevalence of discrimination thrusts people into idleness and bind them in a constant or frequent unemployment against their will. The poor are less often dismissed from our conscience today by being branded as inferior and incompetent. The curse of poverty has no justification in our age. It is socially as cruel and blind as the practice of cannibalism at the dawn of civilization. This is King speaking. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs to be restructured. That's beyond Vietnam right here. He then went on to say, some of us who have already begun to break silence, the silence of the night, have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. We must speak with all humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak, for we are deeply in need of a new way beyond the darkness that seems so close around us. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. He said, the King speaking, he said, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. You know, this King, oh, here's one more. Dives ignored the poor man Lazarus. Dives ended up in hell. The poor man ended up in heaven. America too will go to hell unless she reconsiders and chooses not to be a conscientious objector in the war against poverty. That's King. He was a moral voice. He was a prophetic voice, not bound. And we remind you, when he stood here nearly 50 years ago, Dr. Butler, right there on that Tuesday, after he preached here, some studies say 150 newspapers wrote articles against him. Unions came out against him. Civil rights organizations voted resolutions against him. Preachers came out against him. His invitation to the White House was revoked, but he knew that we were in a time when silence was no longer an option. Dr. Vincent Hardin, the brilliant historian and theologian and close King friend who helped draft that speech, warns us, he warned us while he was living and said, even now it would be tempting to take the cry from the heart of a driven, searching, magnificent brother and file it away as a document for museums and other honorable places. But this speech not only requires us to struggle with the meaning of king, but it calls us to struggle with our meaning as a nation right now. So, my friends, I believe we must reclaim again in the pulpit and in the public square that there comes a time when silence is not an option. Many have described where we are as a nation after this last year's elections, not in terms of one man who now occupies the White House sometimes, but as a moral deficit that occupies the nation. One writer said, in horrific Faustian calculation, these Republican patriots put the nation at risk so that Trump could fulfill his dominant campaign promise. And to be clear, it was not to make America great again, but to make access to America's resources white again. The Klan recognized it, says this author. The white nationalists who gave Trump their full-throated support recognized it. But this wasn't just a fantasy of the far right. The allure of a revived Jim Crow nation that proudly, willfully excludes and debases millions of non-whites was so reaffirming and reassuring to some that everything else became secondary and tertiary, everything including national security. That's what Carol Anderson of Emory has written. Another scholar said, Trump ran his campaign sensing the feeling of dispossession and anxiety among millions of voters, white voters in the main, and many of these voters, not all, but many, followed Trump because he was willing to trumpet their fury and affirm their sense deeply rooted in this nation's history of race and class, that a new world had conspired against their interests. Trump offered no answer to their fear. He said, you are right to be afraid, very afraid. Obama is the boogeyman of a coming diversity that will undo the world you grew up knowing, and I alone can save you. This is not just about one man, this moment we're in, but a moral deficit. And now what do we have? His hands on the nuclear button, the presidential seal, Air Force One, and a tweet keyboard. And in this moment, we must turn away from a resignation to lies and denial and see that it is time for all good citizens to come to the aid of the nation, not to your party, but to the very aid of a nation. We must challenge what is going on now and declare that silence is not an option. Now, while we do indeed face a dire situation, it's not new. And that is the other part of this we must own. Trumpism is as American as apple pie. We talk about Steve Bannon being in the White House 100 years exact to the date almost. Woodrow Wilson had Birth of a Nation in the White House. We must be very clear that every stride toward freedom in U.S. history has been met with the same backlash. Nell Painter, a scholar at Princeton, said, no Obama, no Trump. She said, this is the call and response of American history. You saw it in the first Reconstruction in the 1800s, and then the Deconstruction, the second Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, and then the Deconstruction. And the first one, it was called the Redemption Movement. The basic theme of the Redemption Movement, we have to take our country back and make it America great again. In the second Reconstruction, it was the Southern Strategy, basically the same mantra. We have to take our country back and make it great again. Every season of racial progress has also seen a response of the progress of racism. Daniel Cantor and Barbara Dudley wrote a piece, and it struck me what they said. Donald Trump may be unhinged, erratic, demagogic, and unpredictable, but we cannot afford the luxury of pretending that his election was some kind of historical aberration. It was not. We need only to look back at our history to see how we got here. Only then will we be able to move our country in a better direction. And one of the things Ross Pellis and I have been talking about is we have to have an analysis in this moment. And I looked at this piece by these two authors, and listen to what they said. This country was birthed in colonialism, genocide, and slavery, as well as revolution and democracy, both happening at the same time. But to understand the current moment, we don't have to go back that far. They say, look at 2008. The global economic shell games were exposed, 2007. Finance capital shut down, at least temporarily. And working class America, in fact, the working class around the world were thrown under the bus, costing people jobs, homes, and whatever shreds of financial security they once had. President Obama gets elected, but he can't do much because he has a Congress that will not allow him basically to do anything. They are against everything. So we have a system of ever-widening income inequality, these writers say. And behind all of this, the forces are lifted up against anything the president wanted to do. And then they go on to say the combination of economic anxiety, the insatiable greed of the Koch brothers and their ilk, and a barely sublimated racism against a black man serving our country as president set the stage for Trumpism. Donald Trump appropriated much of Bernie Sanders' rhetoric about Wall Street bankers and billionaires and the globalized economy, but he added vitriol against immigrants, African Americans, Muslims, gangs, drug dealers, and women. And too many people bought the con. So history shows, according to these authors, that just getting rid of Trump will not fix everything that has gone wrong in the United States. We are in the middle of a third Reconstruction. This is a historical moment, a moment of realignments and transformation. And I love the final line in this article: Donald Trump is merely a symptom. And to understand this is to understand what Dr. King said 50 years ago in this pulpit: silence is betrayal. In other words, there comes a time when silence is no longer an option. Let me try for a moment, and in the spirit in which Dr. King preached here, to work through those three things he lifted: racism, materialism, and militarism, and take a moment and look at how they are still alive and why silence is not an option. When we look at the racism of this moment, you know, there's a lot of conversation about Russians hacking the system, which they did. But while we're talking about the Russians, there are serious issues we're not talking about that are closer to home. And that is the hacking of the system by racism. Now, by racism, I don't mean somebody calling you the N-word or something like that. I'm talking about many of the people who claim to be concerned about the hacking that Russia did have actually participated in hacking the system through intentional voter suppression, which is racism. In this past election, there were 868 fewer voting places in black and pure communities, according to Uri Berman. This is the most underreported story of this whole election. We had the worst voter suppression since 2010 that we have seen since Jim Crow. 22 states where 57% of African American voters live, 254 electoral votes, 44 senators, and over half of the United States House of Representatives put in place voter suppression laws. Today, the Voting Rights Act is weaker than it was August 6, 1965, when it was first passed. And some of the very people who are saying they're concerned about Russian hacking have refused to fix the Voting Rights Act since June 25th of 2013. Let me put that in perspective. Strom Thurmond only filibustered the Civil Rights Act of 1957 for 24 hours. Ryan, McConnell, Boehner, and the rest of that crowd have filibustered fixing the Voting Rights Act for over 1,300 days. That's hacking. And it's not just Republican or Democrat. We had 25 presidential debates, and not one debate in the primary or the general election was on voting rights. Not one. Democrat or Republican. State legislatures have passed race-based apartheid redistricting. They've rigged elections, which means we have a lot of unconstitutionally constituted state legislatures around the country, and those state legislatures that are unconstitutionally constituted have passed unconstitutional redistricting that have put place in the people in the Congress who wouldn't be there unless there had been this form of redistricting. Racism is alive and well. And on top of that, we've got a 45 lying about voter fraud in so-called urban, quote unquote, communities, black and brown communities, while denying the truth about voter suppression. And now we have, talk about racism, an attorney general who is not the friend of voting rights, but the adversary of voting rights, sitting as the United States Attorney General. This is systemic racism. And when we consider that this is 147 years after the signing of the 15th Amendment, racism, open, overt, in your face racism is still hacking our political system. Racism in voting so bad that a federal court, when they ruled on the case in North Carolina, said it was surgical racism. Surgical racism. And you know that when you suppress the vote, that's immoral, because we only give the right to vote to citizens, and you can only be a citizen if you're a human being. So if you suppress the right to vote, you are suppressing my humanity. And when this is going on, silence is no longer an option. Well, when we look at our economic and poverty realities and materialism, silence is not an option. A few years ago, Peter Elderman, a professor of law at Georgetown, did an article in the New York Times, and he said, we've done a lot of things that work, Social Security to food stamps. 40 million people have been, these programs keep 40 million people out of poverty. But in his article, he raises this question, why a book? He said, why is it so hard to end poverty in America? He goes on to say, we've been drowning in a flood of low-wage jobs for the last 40 years. Most of the income of people in poverty comes from work. 104 million people, a third of the population, have annual incomes below twice the poverty line, less than $38,000 for a family of 3. Half the jobs in the nation pay less than $34,000 a year, according to the Economic Policy Institute. Wages for those who work on jobs in the bottom half have been stuck since 1973, but they've been rising and rising and rising. Wealth has for the upper echelon. 20 million people earn incomes below half the poverty line. $9,500 for a family of 3. 6 million people have no income other than food stamps. Race and gender play an enormous role. 27% of African Americans, Latinos, and poor Latinos and American Indians, many of them are poor, 10% of whites, and at the same time that whites constitute the largest number among the poor. And we need to talk about this because when we look at measures to raise incomes and measures to help the poor, and we look at the states that have the majority of whites that vote, they are supporting candidates that pass voter suppression. And here's the interesting connection. In the same states that pass voter suppression, they have the lowest wages, the highest poverty, the lowest funding of public education, and the most resistance to health care expansion. So they end up hurting the very people that are voting for the voter suppression. I've been hanging around a little bit over the last few weeks preparing Reverend Butler with Robert Reich, reading his book, Saving Capitalism for the Many, Not the Few, and Joseph Stiglitz, The Price of Inequality. In that piece, there's some interesting things. One says the standard assumption that work determines worth and validates one's personal virtue and responsibility is confounded by a substantial increase in the number of people working full time who are still poor. Some have the idea that the poor don't work. The reality is that America's poor work diligently, the author says, often more than 40 hours a week, sometimes in 2 or more jobs, yet they and their families remain poor. It goes on in that book to say, The Threat to Capitalism, chapter 17, the richest 400 Americans have more wealth than the bottom 50% of Americans put together. The wealthiest 1% owns 42% of the nation's private assets. University of Illinois at the Irvine-Champaign found in 2012 that 52% of fast food workers were dependent on some form of public assistance. Now, understand what that means. There's 64 million people that make less than $15 an hour. 54% of African Americans make less than $15 an hour, and the government gives a subsidy to corporations, the very people who say they want government out of the way, but they take a $7 billion subsidy so that their workers can get certain public assistance rather than them having to pay those workers what they deserve. And in the 2012 elections, hadn't come out yet all about 2016, but 2012 election, the Koch brothers political network spent more than $400 million. $400 million. This was twice the political spending of the 10 largest labor unions representing people. And this same article in these books that I've been reading says we are the richest country, but we rank 34th of the 35th advanced nations in child poverty. America, America, God shed his grace on you. Where is the grace? Mayor Wright Edelman talks about how much poverty we have, and if we would just take 2% of our federal budget and put it in programs that work, we could eradicate 60% of poverty among children. And yet, America, America, where is your grace? We segregate communities by income, and that results in more segregation by race, and then those communities have the poorest schools because we fund the schools based on property tax, and the property tax in those segregated low-income communities are smaller. The top pay a smaller percentage of their income than those with much less. And we just came through and we saw in Washington, D.C., an effort to strip health care. First, it started some years ago by, I won't say the word that Cornel West calls it, I'll change it up. They blackanized it. That's when you don't call it the Affordable Care Act, you call it Obamacare. So much so that there's somebody, I saw a video the other day of a person saying, I don't like Obamacare, I don't have Obamacare. And this person said, well, what do you have? Said, I have the Affordable Care Act. But that Obamacare, you know, calling it Obamacare is another form of racial code words. It's what one author talks about, racism without racists. It's using code word and dog whistles. And we just saw an attempt, and they claim they're not over, to strip health care. My daughter was sharing with me that they wanted to take $868 billion from Medicaid. That would have been the largest attack on the poor pre the war on poverty. And think about the moral deficit that we're in, and why what Dr. King said about betrayal, silence will be betrayal, is apropos today. What stopped the bill? It was not, wait a minute, we should not do this. It was not, you know, we all put our hands on Bibles and swore ourselves into office, and if Jesus, who many of them claim they believe, did anything, he set up free health clinics, so we shouldn't be cutting people since Jesus didn't ever charge a leper a copay or anything like that. What stopped the bill? That there were people who wanted to make it worse. It was already bad. And what stopped it was a group who said it isn't hurtful enough. And the very group, most of them come from the very states where the people that voted them in the office, and many of them white, need that health care. In my state alone, North Carolina has refused to expand Medicaid. 500,000 people, 346,000 of them are white. Only about 120,000 are black. Harvard said for every 5,000 people that are denied 500,000 people denied Medicaid expansion, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 die. People are dying not because God called them home, but because governors will not expand Medicaid. And so I like what Dr. Stiglitz says. We do have a divided society, but the division is not between the freeloaders and the rest of us. It is between those who see America as a community and recognize that the only way to achieve sustained prosperity is to have shared prosperity, and those who don't and just want to keep everything for themselves. We are in a divided society. Divided between the haves and the have-not, Dr. Stiglitz says, a country in which the rich live in gated communities, send their children to expensive schools, and have access to first-rate medical care. Meanwhile, the rest live in a world marked by insecurity, at best mediocre education, and in effect, they do not have health care, and they hope and they pray they don't get seriously sick. And at the bottom are millions of young people alienated without hope. And if I ever hear another person say, but the rest of us pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps, I'm going to scream. And when you understand this, you know silence is not an option. Well, what about that third thing, militarism? Militarism, right now, there's a conversation about adding $54 billion to an already bloated war machine. A machine that already has the ability to destroy the world several times over. Isn't once enough? A war machine that's so out of control that just a few weeks ago killed hundreds of innocent families and children in Mosul by so-called U.S. allied airstrikes in the war against ISIS. Exactly what many folk predicted would happen. Remember when the president said that he would do carpet bombing? And it smacks of the Vietnam-era statement, we had to destroy the village in order to save it. And now we want to add $54 billion. We toss around these figures, Pastor Butler, too easy. $54 billion. $1 billion, if we didn't go to war, could pay for 12,000 and some change elementary school teachers for 1 year. Could create 17,000, almost 18,000 infrastructure jobs, could make sure that 96,000 military veterans receive VA medical care for 1 year, and could provide 30,000 scholarships for university students for 4 years. That's what $1 billion. What will make us safer? $54 more billion to a war machine, or jobs, education, health care, and infrastructure? What would make us safer? What would make fewer instead of more people hate us? Would it be better if we would help provide food and clean water around the world and stop cursing religions just to scapegoat somebody? What would make us safer? Lifting up the world or bombing and invading? And $54 billion, what could that pay for? 971,000 infrastructure jobs for 1 year. 1.63 million scholarships for university students, 22 million children receiving low-income health care, 15 million adults receiving low-income health care, and 37 million households with solar electricity. Dr. King said it long ago. It's not that we don't have the money, our moral priorities are wrong. And so when we hear this about racism and materialism and economic injustice, there's an eerie sign that we've still got work to do. And then if you add on top of all of this, as we began to see now in America, the early signs of fascism, I went back and started looking at what are the signs. Let me tell you some of them. Constant lying, leadership cult worship, devaluation of the free press, extreme nationalism, golden age promises that somehow this person is going to take us back to a time when all was well, and the demand for complete and unquestionable loyalty. And when we see these things, racism and materialism and militarism and the rise of fascism, or at least the rise of signs of it, we know that silence is not an option. Something's happening. A few weeks ago, bishops, Catholic bishops and others came together and they wrote a declaration, and they said every human is sacred. They said in this declaration, the lack of good jobs, affordable housing, and clean water and air is literally killing people. Racism is stripping Black, Latino, Asian, Muslim, Native people of their humanity. Racism and white supremacy are America's original sin. And then they said, at this moment of fear and anxiety, we urge our clergy and faith communities to speak and act boldly in solidarity with our people. In other words, silence is not an option. Zora Neale Hurston said, if you are silent, about your pain, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it. In other words, silence is not an option. Dr. King declared we needed a moral revolution in '67. And if we needed a moral revolution in '67, God knows we need a moral revival today. We need a political Pentecost where we regain our speech and we learn once again how to talk in the tongues of justice and love and mercy, that we can challenge the narrative of the forces of oppression. We have to begin to reframe the conversation, not to talk about left policies and right policies, but let's talk about violence versus nonviolence. You know how Coretta Scott King said it? She said, listen, poverty can produce violence. She said, starving a child is violence, suppressing a culture is violence, neglecting school children is violence, discrimination against a working person is violence, ghetto housing is violence, ignoring people's medical needs is violence, contempt for equality is violence, and even a lack of willpower to do anything or say anything to help humanity is a sick and sinister form of violence. So the question for us today is, are we going to be on the side of violence or nonviolence? I choose nonviolence. Silence. Silence is not an option you can choose anymore. We must, with moral language, say we are against policies, not because they're conservative policies or liberal policies, but we are against these policies because they are morally indefensible and they are constitutionally inconsistent and economically insane. We must break the silence. We must begin breaking the silence, though, in the house of God. Judgment must begin right in the house of God, because we must declare silence on the issues of love and justice and mercy is sin. I know y'all don't use that word up here too much in New York, but down south, we call it what it is. I hear your pastor back here saying amen. Sin. And sin is also the theological heresy that says the only issues we should speak on are being against homosexuality, for prayer in the school, being anti-abortion and pro-tax cut, private property rights, and telling the lie that Jesus is a founding member of the National Rifle Association. That is sin. The prophets of the Bible spoke out against sin, injustice, and mistreatment of the poor. The greatest sin in the Bible is the sin of idolatry, worshiping things, worshiping money, worshiping power. The second greatest sin that flows out of the sin of idolatry and exists wherever people worship themselves and say, I and I alone can fix things, is the injustices toward the least of these. There are more than 2,500 scriptures in the Bible that deal with the issue of injustice toward women and the stranger and the poor and the sick and the hurting and the unacceptable. And anything that does that is sin. Isaiah 10 says, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor poor of their right. Isaiah 58 says, cry loud and spare not. Speak up and tell the nation to loose the bands of wickedness. Translation from Hebrew, pay people what they deserve. Proverbs 31 says, lift your voice on behalf of those who are broken. Luke 4 says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor. We must reclaim this bibliology, this kind of Bible ethic, and speak with moral authority, because silence is not an option. Oh, hallelujah. There would have been no labor movement without the social gospel. There would have been no abolition movement without the preaching of William Lord Garrison and Frederick Douglass and other people of deep faith. There would have been no women's suffrage movement without voices of faith like Sojourner Truth and Eddie Canton State. There would have been no New Deal without people like Sister Francis, who came to work for Roosevelt and declared the social gospel. There would have been no civil rights movement if Dr. King had not started in Montgomery saying, if we're wrong, God is wrong. If we're wrong, the Constitution is wrong. If we're wrong, Jesus is wrong. Dr. King knew this kind of biblical ethics. He knew this kind of hermeneutic, which is why 50 years ago he called for a time to break silence about the injustices in society. And in the face of poverty and inequality that are still rampant, and voting rights being trampled, and millions of people lacking health care and living wages, and racism and hatred and bigotry are all still alive, we too must break silence. Touch your neighbor and say, break silence. Yeah. We are called to stand up for justice and tell the truth, because number one, we cannot allow wrong to have the last word. We must say something. We must interrupt the narrative of extremism. We must say something. When they talk about what we can't do, we must say something about pro-labor, anti-poverty policies that build up economic democracy through full employment, living wages. We must say something about the alleviation of disparate unemployment. We must say something about a just transition away from fossil fuels. We must say something about labor rights and affordable housing. We must say something about direct cash transfers and other support for families struggling to get by. We must say something about fair and just policies for immigrants, since everybody come over here are immigrants except for the First Nation and African Americans who came in the bottom of Slave Street. We must say something about challenging the war policies that preempt the real war on poverty. We must say something about defending the sanctity of the lives of all people of the world, whether they're red, they're yellow, they're black, or otherwise. We must say something about equality in education and ensuring that every child receives a high-quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse education. When people want to take public money and give it to private schools, we must say something. We must say something. We must finally stand flat-footed and say the truth. Yes, we want to save the Affordable Care Act, but that's not what we really want. We really want universal health care and single payer for every human being. We must say something. We must say something about protecting the environment. We must say something about a bunch of men trying to tell women what to do with their bodies. We must say something. When people want to put more money in the prison industrial system complex, we must say something about fairness in the criminal justice system, addressing the continuing inequalities that hurt black people and brown people and poor white people. And when the NRA wants more guns, we must say it's time out for the bloodthirst and the vampire mentality of the NRA. How many more people do you want dead? We must say something. We must say something about voting rights and women's rights and LGBTQ rights and labor rights and religious freedom. And we must tell the truth. The same people that are against voting rights are against LGBTQ rights. And the same people against LGBTQ rights are against environmental justice. And the same people against environmental justice are against living wages. And the same people against living wages are against health care. And if they are sinister enough to be together, we ought to call everybody to come together. We must say something. But not only we can't allow wrong to have the last word, we can't allow wrong and injustice to have the loudest word. Touch your neighbor and say, get loud and draw a crowd. Yeah. I'm reminded of the movie Ragtime, that musical, and in the story, a successful black piano player named Colehouse Walker Jr. sets off a revolt after his wife is shot and killed by the police for trying to shake hands with then President Teddy Roosevelt. And at the end of the play, just before his last stand, he sings the song, Make Them Hear You. He doesn't say, ask them to hear you. He says, go out and tell the story. Let it echo far and wide. Make them hear you. How that justice was our battle and how justice was denied. Make them hear you. And say to those who blame us for the way we choose to fight that sometimes there are battles which are more than black and white. We must say something, and we can't let wrong have the loudest say. Somebody shout, say something. And finally, silence is not an option because we must have a living word. Not just we must deny them having the last word and deny the loudest word. We must have a living word. Not just an analysis of the pain, but a word that points us toward the kind of subversive hope that gives people the possibility to fight up out of valleys of dry bones. We must dare to raise the question, is America possible? Is one nation under God with liberty and justice for all possible? Can these bones live? Can Lazarus get up from the grave even though death has lasted a while? And then we must say yes and join our place among the generations before us who faced and had to raise the same question against odds that were much greater than the ones we face today. If they said something in the face of slavery, if they said something in the face of Jim Crow, if people said something in the face of the Holocaust, if they said something in the face of apartheid, surely we can say something and sound a living word. Because silence is sin. We can't see injustice and say nothing. We can't see exploitation and say nothing. We can't see systemic poverty and say nothing. We must have a living word. We can't see the abuse of other human beings and say nothing. We are called to speak to the death of our times. Your former pastor, Dr. Forbes, said that. We are called to speak, go right to the graveyard. Walk down in the valley and speak, not based on popularity, not based on whether it will be heard, because America is a stiff-necked nation. We don't speak just because we're sure it's going to work, but we speak because God summons us to speak. And God promises to give our moral voices moral power and a transformative impact in God's own time. And you see, amidst all the myths, it seems like, Pastor Butler, God just demands a contrast. We must engage in the risky business of debate and differing with the powerful forces of our day. We are not allowed to enter a depressive silence and just go along with wrong and injustice and allow it to have complete and absolute control of the mic. There must be a dissenting voice in every age. As Walter Wink says, somebody got to name the powers and then reclaim and redeem the power. We are not allowed to check out just because Fox News has the microphone and oligarchs have the money and Trump has the tweet. No, we are not allowed to stand down, and we cannot sound retreat. What God said to Ezekiel, and as God said to Martin, God is saying to us, son of man, daughter of man, stand on your feet, say something. Silence is not an option. What Jesus did at the graveyard of Lazarus, we must do in the face of the despair of our day. How will the haters know that their hate is wrong unless we raise a word? How will injustice know the depth of its wrong unless we raise a word? How will oppression know the depth of its oppression unless we say something? How will division know the pain of prejudice unless we say something? How can we redeem even our adversary unless we say something? How will humanity know that it is violating the ethic of God's beloved community unless we say something? Howard Thurman, in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, claimed, where do we stand and who do we speak for? These are the questions of the faithful for every age. Our speech is not promised instant receptivity. You might have to move a stone or two. You might have to go down in the dry bones and they get up, but they still don't have breath in them. But the old preachers in my tradition told us, you haven't preached until we've done it in hostile territory. Noah preached 120 years. Isaiah was told only 10% would hear him. Ezekiel had to speak in the valley. Jesus had to preach in the graveyard. Gandhi said, first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then you fight, and then you win. When Dr. King spoke, I told you that next day, after being in this pulpit, 150 newspapers, unions, civil rights organizations came against him. But even then, at his last SCLC meeting, he said, I've decided to stick with love. For I know that love is ultimately the only answer to mankind's problem. I'm going to tell it everywhere I go. I know it isn't popular to talk about in some circles, but I'm not talking about an emotional, bougie kind of love. I'm talking about strong, demanding love. I've seen too much hate, and I'm going to stay with love. How many in here have seen too much hate? You've heard too much hate. You've seen too much hell. You've seen too much harm done in the lives of human beings to be silent anymore. One of the proudest things as I go to my seat that I have on my desk in my study is an arrest sheet that says arrested. In fact, I got about 7 of them. It says arrested in the North Carolina State House for praying, singing, and talking loud. Yeah, God. That's what it says. That's what it says. In other words, I got arrested with 1,000 other folk for saying something. And we said something until we won in the courts. We said something until we changed the election. And the call to Ezekiel and to us is not the call to declare what will always get applause, but whether the opinion polls are on your side, whether people hate you, whether powerful forces choose to listen or not, silence is not an option. I'm not going to give up on God's way, God's love, God's justice, God's mercy, God's vision. Speak. And God tells Ezekiel that he must speak because there's some dry bones laying around. And Jesus, you got to speak because there's some Lazarus in the grave. And these dry bones and Lazarus in the grave represent people bruised and battered and beaten down by the oppressive forces of the world. People who believe that the forces of injustice have won. People whose spirit and life have been taken out of them by the constant battering of the language. People who said, I never thought this could happen in my nation. Dry bones and Lazarus represent those who are poor, who've been told their poverty is their own fault. Children who among us who've been discounted and criminalized because of their color and their economic location. That's what the dry bones and Lazarus represents. The sick who've heard mean politicians declare that giving health care is un-American and even un-Christian, one said, because he said, the poor will always be with you. Workers beaten down by the battering ram of anti-union forces and corporate greed. Immigrants who've been called aliens, who helped build this country, who've been vilified in a land of immigrants. Gay people who've been told in so many ways that they are to be hated. And somehow they're deformed and not fully human, despised, and treated like something other than God's creation. African Americans who see mean and power-drunk politicians working to take away voting rights and many other things that have overcome past racism only through the sacrifice and crucifixion of the blood of the martyrs. What if the dry bones and the Lazarus that are laying around, that are in the grave, those still have one thing they can do? They can hear. Can't get up just yet. Can't come out just yet. But they can hear. They can hear when we dare to speak. And when they hear the words of justice and hope, it'll bring them together. The dry bones will live, Liz. Lazarus will form a movement. That's why on tomorrow we're going to be announcing the souls of poor folk, auditing America. Since the Poor People's Campaign challenged America's national morality, classism, racism, and militarism. Oh yes, we're getting ready not just to remember the Poor People's Campaign, but to redo it. To redo it in states across this nation. The Kairos Center and Repairs of the Breach and Drum Major Institute and others are coming together because it's time to say something. I've been traveling all over this country, and I've been speaking a little bit of truth, and I'm telling you what I see. I see the bones and Lazarus coming together. I see Muslims and those of faith coming together with Christians and Jews. I see black and white folk and Latinos and Native Americans and Asians coming together when they hear the words of truth and love. I've seen young people and old people coming together. I see gay folk and straight folk coming together. I'm seeing the unemployed and the righteous business people come together. I see teachers and students coming together, women and men coming together. Even in the Moral Monday movement, we saw people of different political parties come together. We had 11% Republicans went to jail with us. They said, that's not who we are. We're not extremists. I see the Moral Revival and Repairs of the Breach and Kairos and Black Lives Matter and Fight for 15 and coming together. We must speak because faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. The dry bones need a word from the Lord. Lazarus needs a word from the Lord. Silence is not an option. There's an army out there. They're in the valley right now. They're in the grave, but there's an army out there. And if we speak, the people we need are like Lazarus. The people we need are like those bones in the valley. And if we don't remain silent, if we speak God's word and declare God's truth, my friends, they will come together. I'm telling you, as I go to my seat, I would quit preaching tomorrow. No, I'd quit right now. I know I've been long, but that's because I'm a Southern boy. I got a drawl. But anyway, I would quit. I'd quit. But I found out too many times that when you declare the living word of God, resurrection can come out of death. I wish I had a witness. Bones can come out of valleys. Lazarus will come out of the grave. Hope will come out of despair if we dare to speak with our marching, speak with our protesting, speak with our litigating in the court, speak with our going to jail. If we speak, a new army will rise. A new nonviolent army coming up out of the graves and coming up out of the dry bone. All I stop by to tell you is somebody hurting my brother, and it's gone on far too long, and we can't be silent anymore. Somebody's hurting my sister, and somebody's hurting the Muslims, and somebody's hurting gay people, and somebody's hurting the poor, and somebody's hurting the immigrants, and somebody's hurting black people, and somebody's hurting the children, and somebody's warmongering, somebody's trying to take health care, somebody's trying to take voting rights, and we won't be silent anymore. We can't be silent anymore. We shall not be silent anymore. We must not be silent anymore, because silence is not an option.